The rules set by the World Chess Federation, or FIDE, are applied in chess. According to the rules of FIDE, the movement of white pieces is carried out by the player first moving the piece, then the black piece, and then the sequence continues until the end. A player can move one piece, except during the game of chess. In many places, two pieces are moved like this. This is wrong. In this episode, we will handle the pieces correctly. To make 6 different types of moves, a piece can only go to the empty square. If there is a piece of your own side in a square, it cannot go to that square. But if there is an opponent's piece, it can move the opponent's piece and sit on that square. In chess, this is called capture. That is, a white piece cannot capture another white piece and sit on that square. And a black piece cannot capture another black piece and sit on that square, but according to the rules, any black piece can be captured by any white piece. Similarly, any black piece can capture any white piece. Rook can go straight to any square without crossing any other piece. For example, in this case, rook can go to any square marked with a red circle. From d4, rook can go to d8 square, or he can go to h4 square, or he can go to d2 square, but he cannot go to f7 square from d4 square. To go to f7 square, he has to make 2 moves. Rook can come to d7 square in 1 move, then after playing black, rook can go to f7 square. Or after coming to f4 square from d4 square, he can go to f7 square in another move. Again, in this case, rook cannot cross pawn and go to h4 square. Again, he cannot move pawn and sit on g4 square, because white piece cannot capture white piece. Similarly, rook cannot cross knight and go to d7 square, but white rook can definitely capture and sit on d6 square because of black knight. That is, black player will lose black knight. That is, rook can go to any square of file or rank in which file rank is located. He cannot cross any piece. It can directly capture the opponent's piece and sit on that square. The bishop can move to any square diagonally without crossing another square. For example, in this case, the bishop can move to any square marked with a red circle. It can move from the d4 square to the h8 square, or from the d4 square to the a7 square, or it can move to the f2 square, but it cannot move from the d4 square to the h4 square. To move to that square, it will take 2 moves. The bishop must move to the f6 square in 1 move, then the black player can move to h4, or it can move from the d4 square to the f2 square, then the black player can move to h4. In this case, the bishop cannot move to the g7 square by crossing the knight. Again, the knight cannot move to the f6 square. The black piece can never capture the black piece. Similarly, it cannot move to the a7 square by crossing the queen in this direction. But it can move to the c5 square or the b6 square by moving the queen. That is, the black piece can capture the white piece. As a result, the white player will lose the queen. That is, the bishop can move to any square diagonally. It cannot cross over another piece. It can move the piece on each side of the board and sit on that square. Note that the bishop on the white square can never go to the black square, or the bishop on the black square can never go to the black square. Queen can go straight or diagonally to any square without crossing any other piece. For example, in this case, the queen can go to any square marked with a red circle. From the d4 square, the queen can go to the d8 square, or it can go to the h8 square, or it can go to the h4 square, or it can go to the b4 square, but it cannot go to the g2 square from the d8 square. To reach the g2 square, it will take at least 2 moves. It can reach the f2 square in 1 move, then the black piece will move, and then the queen can go to the g2 square. Apart from that, there are several possible ways to go. Here are some possible paths shown by arrows. Again, in this case, the queen cannot go to the g1 square by crossing the bishop. She cannot move the bishop to the f2 square by moving her own piece. In this way, she cannot go to the d8 square by crossing the queen on each side, but she can sit on the d6 square. Or she can move the queen on each side to the d7 square. That is, the queen can go straight or diagonally to any square. She cannot cross any other piece. It can move any piece on either side of the board, either vertically or horizontally, and sit on that square. It is important to note that no other piece can control as many squares as the queen. That is why the queen is called the most powerful piece. Knight moves 2.5 moves by crossing other pieces like the English letter L. For example, in the e5 square, knight can go straight 2 squares along the file and then 1 square along the rank. F7 or D7. Similarly, it can go to F3 or D3. Again, knight can go straight 2 squares along the rank and then 1 square along the file, i.e. C6 or C4. Similarly, it can go to G4 or G6. That is, we can say that the specialty of knight is that it can move across other pieces. No other piece has this ability. For example, in this case, knight can cross rook and pawn and go to C4. Knight in the middle of the board can control a maximum of 8 squares. But knight in the edge cannot control so many squares. The square where the knight is located has control over the square opposite to it. For example, knight in the white square looks at the black square, and knight in the black square looks at the white square. In the case of capture, like other pieces, knight cannot capture any piece on his side and sit on that place. But he can move any piece on each side and sit on its place. For example, in this case, the knight can move the queen to the D7 square and sit on the D7 square. But he cannot move his own piece to the C6 square. The knight cannot move any piece that he passes over. That is, the knight can move 1 square straight and 1 square diagonally in any direction at the same time. He can move over other pieces. He can move 2.5 squares away from each side and sit on that square. Pawn can move forward 1 space in its own file and can only move 2 spaces on the first move, but it can never go back. For example, white player can move pawn on G2 to G3 on the first move. Later, it can never come back to G2. Black player can move pawn D7 to D6 on the first move, but pawn on this square can never come back to D7. Again, in any first move, it can move 2 spaces instead of 1 space, but all these depend on the player. For example, pawn on E2 can go to E3, but if the player wants, he can move it to E4 instead of E3. Similarly, the first move of the black pawn on E7 can be said to be E5. That is, at any stage of the game, a player can move a pawn 2 spaces from its starting position, but once a pawn is moved, it cannot move 2 spaces again. In the case of other pieces, we have seen that they can move any piece on each side in their path and sit on that place. The rule of capturing a pawn square is an exception. A pawn cannot move a piece in front of it to occupy its place. It doesn't matter if it is white or black. A pawn on D3 can never go to D4 because there is a knight on its own side on this square. A pawn on E4 cannot go to E5 because there are pieces on each side on E5. That is, a pawn can move 1 square forward, but if the square is empty. If there is an opponent's piece on the square in front, the pawn cannot capture it and sit in its place. Again, if there is a piece 2 squares ahead, whether it is on its own side or on the other side, it cannot go to that square. A pawn cannot move to a square that is diagonally in front of it on 1 square. But if there are pieces on each side on the square in front of it, the pawn can capture that piece and move 1 square diagonally. For example, in this case, a pawn on D4 cannot go to C5. But since there is a bishop on each side on E5, it can capture it and sit in its square. Similarly, a pawn on G5 can capture a pawn on H4 and sit in H4. That is, the pawn can move 1 square or 2 squares on the first move. It can move 1 square forward on any move. The pawn can never go back. It can move the piece on each side that is 1 square in front of it and sit on that square. King can move only 1 square in any direction, either straight or diagonally. For example, in this case, the king can move to any square marked with a red circle. From the D4 square, the king can move to the D5 square. It can move to the D3 square, or it can move to the E5 square. The king is the most important piece among the pieces. The victory or defeat of the game is determined on the king. Therefore, the king cannot be moved to a square on which any piece of either side has a view. For example, in this case, the queen of the H4 square can move to all the squares marked with a red circle. In this case, the king could move to any square marked with a red circle, but now he cannot move to these 4 squares d4, e4, f4, and f6, because the queen of either side has a view on these squares. If the king is moved to this square, the queen can capture it directly. In this, the white team will be defeated. Therefore, the king cannot be moved to these squares. Similarly, since the knight has a view on the g3 square, the white king cannot be moved to the g3 square. It can be moved to any square marked with a red circle. Again, in this case, the king can move the pawn of either side. Again, in this case, the bishop can move to the g2 square. But in this case, the knight cannot move to the c2 square, because the bishop of each side has a view of the c2 square. Again, in this case, the knight cannot move to the e2 square. That is, the king can move one square in any direction. It cannot go to a square where the piece of each side has a view. Any piece of each side that is one square away in any direction can move to that square and sit on that square. That's all for today. We will learn some special moves in the next episode.